Hi, everybody. I'm just going to get some of the little bits and pieces out of the way before we pass over to our esteemed speaker today. So thanks for coming. Not a bad turnout for such a sunny day on a Friday, the week before exams. So for those of you who have exams, a special thank you. So I'm just going to let you know about a couple of events that are coming up within the One Network and the Biodiversity Network before I introduce our guest today. Just to let you know, after the talk, there will be drinks in the Place Suite. So then you can talk to Nat in person, talk to each other. If you don't know where the Place Suite is, you can just follow the crowd as usual. So I've been encouraged to please encourage you all to come to the one event on Tuesday the 20th in the Maths Institute. It's an annual lecture, for those of you that don't know. And this year, it's a talk that's actually quite linked to what we're going to be talking about today. It's called Power to the People, Civic Freedoms, Climate Justice, and the Century of the Citizen, with the Chief Executive of the New Economics Foundation. And after that, we'll be having a panel discussion, rights of the environment and people. And the panelists for that will be Anamil Khan from LSE, Dr. Alice Evett from ONZ, Dr. David Cooper from the LCNR, and it will be chaired by Connie McDermott from our own department. It will close at 6 p.m. With a drinks reception. And essentially, it's about civic freedoms and human rights that are under attack in many parts of the world. And at the same time, commitment to climate action feels kind of frail. And it's sort of talking about these systems within a democratic world that's sort of under attack right now. So when citizens have the freedom to express their views, assemble peacefully, and access information, they can maybe organize and mobilize on things that matter to the communities themselves. So this could be a really interesting topic for those that are interested in today's talk. Then there won't be, that same week, there won't be a Friday nature lecture. So we'll just be that one event on Tuesday the 20th from 4 to 6, again in the Maths Institute. And then our final, I can't believe it's the end of term, but our final nature talk will be on the 30th, May the 30th, again at 4:15. Megafauna recovery and the relevance amidst people and poverty in India. That will be Nida Mungi from Aarhus University. So please do come along to those events if you're interested, if you're around. It'd be really nice to see you. So without further ado, I'd really like to invite Nat and Dr. Professor Nathalie Seddon. Well, a lot of you know her from the work that she's been doing around here. I think there are a lot of collaborators here with her, and I'm really, really looking forward to hearing what she has to say today, because I think the two framings that she's going to be putting together, nature-based solutions and Indigenous and local knowledge systems, is something that many of us have been grappling with and thinking about, and I'm very excited to hear about it. Nat has a biography that is just too long and too impressive to even try to summarize. So I'll just give the summary that we decided on for today. So as you probably know, she's a professor of biodiversity and the founding director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative in departments of biology and geography, Smith School and Enterprise for the Environment, and the University of Oxford. She's also a director of the Agile Initiative, member of the leadership team of the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery here, and is a senior research fellow at Wadham College. She founded the Oxford University social venture, Nature-Based Insights Ltd, and well, she's a trained evolutionary ecologist at Cambridge University and has over 25 years of experience in a range of ecosystems across the globe. But she has an incredible amount of experience also in mentorship, leadership, talking about really important concepts and bringing them together with relation to what's going on the ground. And what she's trying to do now is bring this really big concept of nature-based solutions together with some of the things that we're thinking about in terms of local knowledge and local communities. So Nat, thank you for coming, and please do get started.
Great, thank you very much. It's great to be here and great to be speaking as part of this extraordinary seminar series. There's just been so many amazing talks in this room, and I've learned such a lot. And actually, some of the things I'm picking up on, some topics that I'm picking up on, definitely build on what I've learned in others by brilliant colleagues. Just to say, there's a slight echo as I'm speaking, which is a little bit distracting. Do you know is there something we need to turn off here? Perhaps, just otherwise it's going to be a little bit tricky. Is it that one? Apologies. You know what it's like when you can hear your own voice in your ear, it's impossible, yes, to speak. Okay, you hear it? Is it this? We need to turn this off, perhaps?
I could hear it when I was
speaking. Yeah. Okay, I think that's good. Yeah, good. You can still hear me? Yeah, hopefully everyone can hear me online as well.
Thumbs up.
I'm sure someone will let us know if you can't hear online. Okay, all right.
Yeah, I keep coming back.
I don't know. Okay, thanks. So yeah, so I'm a professor of biodiversity, and as was said, I by training I'm an ecologist, a behavioral ecologist. I had the great honor and privilege of spending nearly 20 years working in rainforests around the world, particularly the rainforests of the Andes and the Amazon. Studying, the origins and maintenance of biodiversity, trying to understand why it is that our rainforests, particularly in South America, are so extraordinarily diverse. What ecological and evolutionary processes together? Are you okay? What processes together can explain why the forests are so diverse? And I learned a great deal from those experiences, but inevitably, my fascination for the origins of life, my fascination for understanding biodiversity was eclipsed by my deep, deep concern for how we might protect biodiversity as an issue of ecological justice, as an issue of planetary stability, and really just out of care for the human and for the more than human world. And so I decided to take a sabbatical with the amazing development organization, IIED, which many of you might know, the International Institute for Environment and Development, which is in London. And I took a sabbatical, and I made lots of discoveries while I was there. It was an extraordinary year. But one key discovery was that, which sounds incredibly naive to say it now, but at the time, this discovery that all this rich understanding that we had about biodiversity, about what healthy, flourishing ecosystems look like and how they came to be, wasn't informing climate and development policy in any meaningful way. In other words, big decisions were being made about our lives and the future of our children and our grandchildren that wasn't being informed by ecologists. It wasn't being nourished in that way. And there was almost no nature, no real wild nature, healthy nature in climate change adaptation and mitigation policy at that time. This is about 10 years ago. The second discovery was the discovery that I had of the term nature-based solutions. It was a term that was mentioned to me by my wonderful mentor, the extraordinary and sadly late Dame Georgina Mace, who talked to me about this term nature-based solutions. And it was a very niche term. It had been coined by the World Bank back in 2008. It was sort of picked up by the IUCN and had become quite a major pillar of their work. But it was still quite a niche term just in sort of conservation circles. And it felt at the time that this term had extraordinary potential for trying to unite action across the development community with the conservation community and the climate community. And I felt this might have the power to try and unite these communities underneath a single framework, and it might galvanize action. So I returned from my sabbatical and set up the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. Now, here we are now. This is a picture of the team taken outside the Natural History Museum just down the road here in Oxford during our summer conference on nature-based solutions, the theme of which was growing positive change, and a major theme of which was how we might bring together traditional knowledge with ecological science. We're a very interdisciplinary team. We work in various parts of the world. We do field work, we do regional and global analyses, we're modelers, we're ecologists, we have a mathematician in the team, social scientists, very, very interdisciplinary. But we're all united by this common mission to try and enhance understanding and implementations of nature-based solutions that support thriving human and ecological communities. And the crucial bit, nurture an economy that enhances, that supports the web of life. Now, when we set up the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, we very much sort of, our mission just was captured in the first part of this sentence. More recently, we're pivoting, and our work's pivoting to really trying to address a more fundamental issue of how we transform how nature-based solutions are designed, governed, financed, stewarded in a way that can help transform the economy to one that nurtures rather than unravels the web of life. And that's kind of how this talk is organized as well. And I want to unpack all of this in the next 40 minutes or so. So the thesis of this seminar is as follows. The thesis is that many ecological principles, so many principles that have been derived through experimentation and observation in the field of Western ecology, align with the values that emerge from an ecocentric worldview or a kin-centric worldview that is often central to Indigenous and local knowledge systems. Can I help? Can people hear online?
They can.
They can, okay. Okay, good. Okay, great. So these principles align. And when these principles are applied to the implementation of nature-based solutions, and not just to the implementation, but the leadership of them, the governance of them, the finance of them, design of them, the monitoring and evaluation of them, when they are applied to nature-based solutions, they can be truly transformative. And this turns nature-based solutions into pathways away from isolated short-term projects to pathways to system change. And they have the potential to transform mindsets and societies as much as they do to transform landscapes. So that's the thesis that I want to explore today. So in the first part of the seminar, I want to sort of talk about the promise of nature-based solutions, but also the evidence that we have on the need for transformation. In the second part, I want to talk about the link between transforming nature-based solutions and transforming societies and how different knowledge systems come to bear on that. And then I want to end with what I see as an emerging research agenda and something of a call to action to ecologists. So let's back up a bit and talk a bit about nature-based solutions. So a really important thing happened in 2022, and that is UNEA, United Nations Environment Assembly, agreed on a definition of nature-based solutions. This took a long time. I don't know whether any of you in the room were involved in this process, but there was a lot of word wrangling. It took days and days and days, and we've ended up with a very large, rather cumbersome, all-encompassing, very inclusive definition of nature-based solutions, which is on the slide. I'm not going to read out, but it encompasses diversities of ecosystems, diversities in terms of economic as well as environmental, societal well-being, as well as ecological outcomes. But put simply, we often, at least at the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative in our publication, sort of condense this to these are actions that involve working with enhancing nature as part of nature to address societal goals whilst bringing local benefits to biodiversity and people. And these benefits to biodiversity and people really need to be local for nature-based solutions to be resilient and to be able to support transformation and societal challenges. And as I will unpack later, I think this part of the definition that includes as being part of nature is critically important. So, you know, nature-based solutions are grounded in the knowledge that healthy, biodiverse ecosystems support society in multiple ways. This has been incredibly well evidenced from science and practice over many, many years, and vice versa. society supports the flow of those services to people as well. It's a two-way interaction between people, place-based partnership between people and nature. The concept of a nature-based solution also recognizes that societal challenges, particularly biodiversity loss and climate change, share some of the same drivers, so then at least in theory should share some of the same solutions. But however, the term also reflects the fact that the extent to which nature supports society very much depends on how we work with it, and importantly, and as I will argue, how we relate to it as well. Now, it's important to say I don't believe that nature-based solutions are the only solutions we have to the challenges we face. Clearly, they need to run alongside behavioral change, some technological approaches as well. But one of the key things about many nature-based solutions on land and in the sea is that they're ready to be taken to scale now, whereas many technological approaches are nascent at best. So in practice, what are we talking about? And I'm sure you're all very familiar. In the agricultural landscapes, we're talking about permaculture, polyculture, agroforestry, silver pasture, those types of more regenerative, agrobiodiverse forms of agriculture, which there is now growing evidence and many new meta-analyses recently published showing the multiple benefits that those types of practices can bring in terms of increasing carbon sequestration, securing yields in drier and more variable climates, supporting diverse livelihoods and reducing sensitivity to the impacts of climate change, and many, many other benefits as well. We know that these include things like coastal restoration, restoring our salt marshes, our mangrove forests, our seagrass meadows, our kelps, especially when they are restored and protected in tandem so that different ecosystems can work together and protect one another in a warming world. We know that this can reduce wave attenuation, reduce coastal flooding, erosion, and so forth. Very, very good local studies as well as global analyses showing those benefits of coastal nature-based solutions in building resilience and supporting adaptation to climate change. And I would argue that the wealth of evidence that we have on the effectiveness, the ecological as well as the social and economic effectiveness of nature-based solutions comes from the benefits for adaptation and resilience. But we also know that restoring ecosystems and catchments can reduce flood risks and landslides. We know that bringing nature into our cities, whether blue infrastructure such as rivers and swamps, and green infrastructure such as allotments and city forests, green walls and so forth, gardens, they can significantly reduce temperatures during heat waves, increase the infiltration into the ground, so reduce flood risk, whilst bringing benefits in terms of physical and particularly mental health, particularly for young people. All of that is really, really very well demonstrated. So these are all examples. There are many, many more. I'm sure many of you are involved in examples of really good nature-based solutions around the world. But that's just to make sure we're on the same page with what we mean by a nature-based solution. And in all of these cases, we're talking about diverse native species mainly, or at least diverse mixes of functionally healthy ecosystems with ecologically rich taxa. So, as I say, there's a lot of evidence. We in Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, certainly in the early years, one of the main things we focused on was evidence syntheses. There's enormous numbers of studies have been published on nature-based solutions, whether defined as such or implicitly so. As I say, I think the wealth of support for the effectiveness of working with nature in the warming world comes from evidence on the extent to which nature-based solutions can reduce impacts from climate change and reduce climate hazards. We produced one of the first global systematic reviews back in 2020, reviewing the evidence internationally on the effectiveness of reducing climate hazards, providing evidence that most of those interventions also brought benefits, whether in terms of livelihoods or greenhouse gas sequestration or whatever that might be, or many of the other societal benefits were supported. More recently, we've been looking at, we did a systematic review of systematic reviews, looking at the economic benefits, in particularly the benefits for the economic recovery potential of investing in nature-based solutions, and found lots of evidence, particularly from the continent of Africa, particularly when thinking about agricultural, agroforestry, and so forth, lots of evidence that those types of interventions not only reduced economic losses because they reduced drought risk or flood risk or improved reduced erosion, but because they also provided jobs, good jobs in the economy. They had high economic recovery potential. So there's that as well. And I think much of our work at NBSA, as I say, has really been focused on adaptation, but we also have been working on the question of the role of nature-based solutions in supporting climate change mitigation. And there's some wonderful work published relatively recently conducted by Eline Sotteroni, who's in the audience, really highlighting the importance of regional models for really trying to understand the role of nature-based solutions such as halting deforestation and restoring native vegetation and helping nations meet their climate goals. And her analyses, her modeling approach showed that Brazil, obviously very, very rich in terms of its native ecosystems and the extent of forest, low historical emissions, we estimated that it could go to 80% of its net zero pledge by investing in nature-based solutions, and particularly by halting deforestation. And I think this type of work really highlights the importance of doing the regional work. We know that other parts of the world, other countries, nature-based solutions play a less significant role in climate change mitigation, and other approaches are needed alongside nature-based solutions. The work that we've done, I mean, there's a lot of focus or a lot of conflation of nature-based solutions with carbon offsetting and so forth, and I'll get onto that. There has been a massive focus on the role of nature-based solutions in helping us cool the planet. It's an extremely difficult thing to do at a global level, which is why I just highlighted the regional analyses. But there's a broad consensus among different groups that have been looking at this, that despite all the caveats and the complexities of trying to create a global estimate for the mitigation potential of scaling up nature-based solutions on Earth, there's agreement that around 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year of mitigation through avoided emissions, as well as increased absorption through removals, is possible, which is equivalent to around reducing peak warming by around 0.3 degrees towards the end of the century. But what this study showed, and what many other studies have been very, very clear on, and which is obviously very theoretically true as well, is that nature-based solutions are clearly not an alternative to keeping fossil fuels in the ground. 0.3 degrees of peak warming is not standalone. You don't get that unless you also do the radical decarbonisation across all parts of the economy as well. But I don't want to talk too much about this. I'm sort of just giving a little bit of an overview of sort of where we're at with some of the evidence and where the strength of the evidence is. But on the basis of this sort of evidence, there has been a lot of interest in nature-based solutions. As I'm sure you're aware, they are now embedded in the text of the UNFCCC, the Convention on Biological Diversity. They were in the text of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Most signatories to the Paris Agreement now include nature-based solutions in their climate pledges, or at least they use those words in their climate pledges. Often they're not what we would define as a nature-based solution. There's a very strong reliance there on afforestation rather than reforestation or native generation. But the term nature-based solutions is in the nationally determined contributions. And during the period since we established the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative in 2016, 2017, there's been a huge increase in the number of scientific studies that have included the term nature-based solutions in their title or their abstracts. And that's what this graph shows here. During the same period, we've seen a huge interest in the corporate sector as well, and in the general public and civil society. The blue line here shows the increase in hits on Google. If you put the term nature-based solution into a Google engine, when I did that in 2016, there weren't very many. If you do that today, you'll probably find something of the order of 70 to 80 million hits. During this period, funding for nature, as far as we can determine, and I should caveat that these graphs on how much funding there is for nature with the fact that it's incredibly difficult to work out what we mean by that, what is meant by that, and what counts in terms of funding for nature. But these are figures from the United Nations Environment Programme, basically showing that in around 2017, 2018, there are around $50 billion of funding per year was being mobilized for nature. And this has grown to just under 200 billion in 2023. More about that shortly. But we need a reality check. And this is where I'm getting sort of the pivot that I want to make in this talk, having given a bit of an overview on the evidence and the traction around nature-based solutions. We know the reality is that nature-based solutions are still massively understood in civil society and especially in the corporate sector and in many governments. They are often reduced to or misunderstood as carbon-focused projects, offset schemes, tree planting plantations, and so forth. Many pledges, as I've mentioned just briefly before, focus on afforestation projects, so planting trees where trees don't naturally grow in areas that are not ecologically suitable for trees, without addressing the root problem of dependence on fossil fuels. And the term nature-based solution has, like many green terms before it, been co-opted by companies who are using that term as a greenwashing tool, masking ongoing harm to the biosphere and the climate system. And the problem is, of course, is that when driven by markets alone, things like nature-based solutions or activities that are badged as nature-based solutions cause risk causing very serious harm to both people and ecosystems, or ecosystems and the human communities dependent upon them, which is all of us, resulting in land grabs. So lots of evidence around the world where land has been grabbed and indigenous communities have been displaced from their ancestral lands, human rights violations, biodiversity loss. In the name of climate change, there are examples of old growth ecosystems, old growth tropical forests, for example, such as the one on the screen here described from Cambodia, which has been replaced with a non-native, in this case, acacia plantation. So old growth forests being replaced by a monoculture of acacia in the name of climate change, which had a very net harm, a harm to biodiversity, displaced local communities who were doing a very good job of stewarding their ancestral lands. And actually, when you did the carbon calculations, was bad for the climate as well. The only benefit was accrued to those who made profits from the plantation that was created there. And there are lots of different examples of these around the world, and they're often badged as nature-based solutions. Okay, so as a result of these sort of evidence coming in from around the world of this sort of practice happening, a lot of good stuff happening as well, and lots of projects that have been labeled as nature-based solutions doing really good things for communities and biodiversity and carbon. But because there's also this happening, there is a movement, or has been a very strong movement, spearheaded by Friends of the Earth and other grassroots activist organizations, and also by many indigenous groups, that want us to abandon using this term. This term is not being useful. It's doing more harm than good, so they say, right? So this is one possibility. We just get rid of this term. Maybe we find a new term. Maybe that'll get co-opted too. Maybe we need to think about these terms as being useful for a while, and then they get co-opted and we need to abandon them. So this is one possibility. We just abandon using this term. Another possibility is we explore the possibility that maybe terms like nature-based solutions are useful. They're kind of like a green Trojan horse. There is evidence that the nature-based solutions have helped get nature a place at the decision-making table. That people talk about nature-based solutions in the treasuries of governments of the world, or they did until quite recently, right? And it feels like once it's in there, then it's up to us as scientists, as members of civil society, as communities, as activists, whoever we are, to say, okay, that's great that you want to invest in nature-based solutions. Do you realize that that means community-led, respectful, respecting local rights, respecting local communities, protecting biodiversity, monitoring and evaluating, doing things right, So maybe there's an opportunity there to, if we really are very clear and we hold the line on what good looks like when it comes to nature-based solutions, perhaps there's an opportunity there, and we shouldn't be in too much of a hurry to abandon the term. So there's the IUCN global standard for nature-based solutions, which has been iterated and approved over time. There are the nature-based solutions guidelines. There are, opportunities to hold governments and businesses to account, to demand social and environmental justice, to try and prevent greenwashing, to make sure that those organizations, those financial institutions that are investing in nature-based solutions are also doing everything they possibly can to decarbonize all parts of their operations. And there's lots of amazing work going on in this space to try and do just that. We've created, a lot of people say, well, what does good look like? What is a good nature-based solution? Well, who are we to say what a good nature-based solution looked like? But maybe there are we can parameterize it in a certain way. emphasizing the importance of diversity locally, human diversity, knowledge diversity, species diversity. So, for example, we have a global case study platform that we've created at the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative with 150 best practice case studies, 10 flagship programs. We're increasing this all the time. And others are doing this. There are lots of these different databases, and these are really helpful for the investor community and others. But the problem is even if we are really good at knowing what good looks like, and even if we try and channel some finance into good projects and hold investors to account, we have the problem of incrementalism. Very dramatic problem of incrementalism. You know, last year was the hottest year on record. We know that biodiversity is tanking. We know that we are making some progress. Our current approaches are piecemeal and incremental and far too slow to match the scale of what's needed. There's this cartoon, which I'm sure you've all seen before, shows with the small scientists going, everything will be okay if we wash our hands, and then there's the huge wave of COVID reaching over them, and another bigger wave of the recession, and the gigantic tsunami of a wave that's climate change, and the biggest wave of all, which is biodiversity loss. And we're still washing our hands. For example, as I say, we feel like we've mobilized nearly 200 billion, or civil society have done an incredible job of trying to do that. Many good actors and well-intentioned people working in the corporate sector and across businesses. We've got 200 billion. It sounds like a lot, except when you look at the amounts that's going in terms of public funding for harmful subsidies, which itself is dwarfed by the amount that's been invested from private finance for extraction. Our current economic system is actively investing in its own demise and needs radically transforming. So, but how do we transform that? And a lot of good effort is going into, trying to repurpose subsidies, trying to use the market to create tools that will help us repurpose some of that finance. But as Einstein says, a problem cannot be solved with the same kind of thinking that brought it about. And as Capra also said, there are solutions to the major problems of our time, some of them even quite simple, but they require a radical shift in our perceptions, our thinking, and our values. But I wonder how radical a shift we really need. Many ecologists in the audience, maybe some physicists, maybe people working with indigenous knowledge systems, because our current economic system, as you all know, is reductive and extractive. It's a post-war linear growth, GDP-oriented model. Insights from ecology, indigenous knowledge systems, quantum physics, systems biology, systems ecology, neuroscience speak to the fact that nature, that the living systems and beyond living systems work in a very, very different way. We need that leaning into a reconfiguration and a redesign of the global economy. So I'm really interested in the role that ecologists in particular, ecological thinking or systems ecological thinking, can play in helping us transform the system. And in particularly, as we are trying and transform nature-based solutions so that they can really achieve their potential of building human well-being, as we do that, can we change the system in tandem with that? So what are the linkages between transforming nature-based solutions and transforming the system? Well, where on earth do we start with this question? And I think we start, a very powerful way of starting that I humbly offer is that we turn to communities around the world that have been working with nature as part of nature for tens of thousands of years. And that is many indigenous groups around the world. And I think when we were in Colombia, many in the popular press certainly and others sort of criticized the Convention of Biological Diversity COP16 event, that it wasn't transformative enough, it didn't get enough done, it was too complicated. But actually something really extraordinary happened, really, really important happened. As I'm sure you're aware, this was the establishment of a new subsidiary body to enable full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, alongside the establishment of the Kali Fund. Which, though it's still voluntary, is nonetheless really important, because this was a commitment that 50% of the profits from the use of biodiversity from the private sector goes back to the people who are looking after and stewarding much of the Earth's biodiversity. So this was transformative because it was a pivot from exclusion to inclusion, which is a massively important part of transformation and system change, knowledge extraction to knowledge partnership, so that's reciprocity and how knowledge is handled, and economic exploitation to benefit sharing. So this in itself is incredibly important. Lots of work to be done in sorting out the details that sit behind this and to operationalize this, but it was very important. Of course, this doesn't just happen overnight. This is a result of decades and decades of hard work, blood, sweat, and tears by many people upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities around the world, including members of those communities. But it was very, very important. And I think there's an overarching ethical imperative as to why this is important, which you needn't go into. But I think there are three very important practical reasons, perhaps some more obvious than others. So we know that much of the world's biodiversity, I mean, there's been controversy and confusion over how much of the world's biodiversity and whether one even should try and put a number on that. But much biodiversity is very effectively protected within the Indigenous territories around the world. There was this lovely study that came out 3 years ago in Nature Sustainability, demonstrating significantly lower levels of deforestation rates inside Indigenous lands compared to non-protected areas, lower levels of degradation in those Indigenous lands comparable to protected areas. And this is one of a number of different studies. Okay. The second reason is that Indigenous and local ecological knowledge is an adaptive knowledge system. It has been honed over millennia, as I said, through experiment and observation, that can be vital and has been shown to be vital for very effective species and habitat conservation, and particularly important for adaptive management. So as the climate warms, some of those Indigenous communities around the world hold very important knowledge as to how best to steward and co-create ecosystems as ecosystem engineers, and learning from that as part of adaptive management schemes is very, very important. So that knowledge is essential, and there have been lots of studies and lots of examples around the world of where the coming together of Indigenous and local knowledge with Western ecological and conservation biology have produced very, very successful conservation outcomes. But the third reason is that many, not all, but many Indigenous peoples and local communities have what could be described as an eco-centric worldview or a kin-centric worldview, which places an intrinsic value on all living and non-living components of our ecosystems and recognizes the interdependence of all forms of life and emphasizes the well-being of the biosphere as a whole. And so, as I mentioned, by training, I'm an evolutionary biologist and an ecologist, trained in quite reductive methods of evolutionary biology and ecology. But we have come to show through those disciplines that not only the reality of the shared ancestry of all beings, evolutionary biology teaches us that, ecology teaches that we are all part of an interconnected, dynamic, diverse web of life. I like to show this slide. This is some of Darwin's early sketches of when he was having ideas about kinship, about common ancestry, and so forth. We've come a very long way technically. Our extraordinary, reductive, but extraordinary technological approaches has enabled us to do comparative phylogenomics. We can now create phylogenies for whole groups of animals. This is a phylogeny, a circular molecular phylogeny of the ants. We also know through our technology that there are all these incredible energy flows going through our systems, and we have the interrelationships between hundreds of species within ecosystems really well mapped out. So all of these are sort of technological support for a view that emerges from an ecocentric worldview. So but according to the ecocentric worldview, people are viewed not as pests, not as conquerors of nature, but as stewards or co-creators. People don't manage resources, they look after their relatives. And there are 4 key values that emerge from an ecocentric worldview. They are relationality, reciprocity, responsibility, and redistribution. Now, I first heard about the 4 Rs in a talk that was given by Lila June, who's an artist and an activist and a scientist, an Indigenous First Nations woman that came to speak at our conference. And she said, these human hands can be a blessing to the earth when guided by the right values and principles. So very much seeing us humans as co-creators and as partners with nature, as part of nature. So I was interested in thinking about how we might apply these principles to how we are thinking about and framing nature-based solutions. But before I sort of unpack that, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with what each of these 4 R's are. So relationality is a value that recognizes that all life forms are interconnected and that well-being depends on the health of the whole. Reciprocity is around mutual care between humans and the more than human world, or humans and ecosystems, giving back as much as we take. Responsibility is around long-term stewardship based on an ethical obligation to care for the environment and for future generations. And redistribution, which is ensuring fair access to the ecological benefits, equal representation, and equitable sharing of responsibilities. So those are the 4 R's, and they are fairly common to many different Indigenous worldviews from around the world. So this doesn't just emerge from one, but there are these commonalities, these 4 R's. There are other R's, respect, for example, reverence, other. It turns out there's lots of R words which are very powerful in this. And interestingly, there is overlap between those 4 principles and actually the guiding principles for transformative change that the IPBES report that was published earlier in this year on transformative change highlighted. So that highlighted the importance of pluralism and inclusion, respectful and reciprocal human-nation relations, adaptive learning and action, equity and justice. So much synergy there between what emerged through the TCA and what emerges when we think about those values. So it's possible to think about the relationship between these values, the 4 R's, ecological principles, and how the application of these values and principles can help us transform nature-based solutions. So for example, if we think about relationality, which speaks to the ecological principles of interconnectedness, ecological networks, feedback loops. This repositions nature-based solutions from isolated projects to whole socio-ecological landscapes in which you have this co-evolution, this dynamic interaction between our waters, our soils, people, other species, and so forth. And this speaks to the need for designing and monitoring in such a way that includes biocultural indicators alongside ecological metrics. And there are lots of examples. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there's for example, the Tsaro ancestral forest restoration in Taiwan here. Once land tenure is returned in that area, those peoples revived patch mosaic forestry, for example, which restored some of the old growth structure, protected the headwaters, and renewed cultural harvests. We can apply reciprocity, which relates to the ecological principles of mutualism, resource sharing, nutrient cycles. And this moves nature-based solutions away from one-way extraction, so like a carbon credit scheme, for example, to much more regenerative actions that return the gifts to ecosystems and communities, circular agroecological methods, for example, enrichment, planting, and so forth. Responsibility speaks to the principles, ecological principles of resilience, succession dynamics, adaptive management. Redistribution speaks to energy flow, keystone species, trophic cascade. So there's some nice synergies here showing that, showing that overlap. So this isn't about favoring one type of knowledge system or another. It's about seeing synergy and seeing complementarity between them. So there's some beautiful examples from all over the world of this. One of them is sort of an example of responsibility in action that I wanted to highlight was Inuit-led Arctic species conservation. So Inuit communities, as you all know, have long practiced very responsible stewardship of species that they really have very strong relationships with and really depend upon for food and for cultural identity. And they see themselves as guardians of Arctic ecosystems, guided by cultural obligations to care for all the species they depend on. And that responsibility is embedded in cultural laws and has been passed through oral histories. And now the situation with many of these communities is that there is co-management of species conservation programs. There's a combination of satellite monitoring, scientific tracking data with Indigenous and local knowledge, such as information about ice conditions, migration patterns, and animal behavior that has been observed over generations and passed down orally. And all of this is ensuring that that adaptive management is ecologically formed and culturally appropriate. Another beautiful example, this time of redistribution in action, is an example from New Zealand, where the Wanganui River was granted legal personhood in 2017. So the Rights for Nature movement is really, really strong now in the world and is gathering momentum. And natural entities, rivers, mountains, and so forth, are increasingly being granted legal personhood status. In other words, they're given the same legal rights as a human being, reflecting the fact that that entity, that natural entity, holds much spiritual, cultural, and ecological significance to the local tribes, in this case Maori tribes. And the river now is represented legally by two guardians, one from the New Zealand government and one from the local Maori, preventing it. And this is preventing or helping to reduce its exploitation. And this is a redistribution of power, rights, and responsibilities among human and the more than human world. And there are many other examples of this around the world. So the key insights I'm wanting to share is that, ecological science provides, you'll know that it provides really interesting and important information about feedback loops, landscape processes, energy flows, adaptive management. And that's really helpful if we want to design effective nature-based solutions. But that isn't even really happening out in the world. So even like basic ecology, fundamental ecology isn't informing the design of nature-based solutions yet, but needs to. And that needs to be complemented in many cases with a more values-based approach rooted in relational thinking, ecocentric worldviews that ensures that nature-based solutions are culturally grounded, ethical, and equitable. So what does all this mean? We need to think in terms of the design. There's lots of different aspects of nature-based solutions that this can really help transform. We need to think about whole system dynamics. We need to focus on long-term ecological and social value rather than just the short-term profits. We know that, but there are ways of operationalizing that. Thinking about governance, empowering local communities, Indigenous peoples where they live, empowering them as co-stewards, prioritizing equity in decision-making. And we need to think about nature-based solutions as things that are embedded within interconnected social and ecological and governance system. So we're transforming nature-based solutions from a sort of nature for people framing to a people as nature framing. You're probably all aware of the, 10 years ago, Georgina Mace published a paper in Science in which she outlined sort of 4 different ways, or 4 different reasons or ways of thinking about why we would want to conserve nature. Nature for itself, nature despite people, nature for people, and people and nature, or nature and people. But this is more towards thinking about a 5th frame or a 6th frame. New frames have been emerging quite recently, but basically nature as culture. So the Nature Futures framework that Bez pulled together, absolutely brilliant work, really was positioning nature as culture, which is quite similar to people as nature. So in terms of what does the research agenda for this transformation look like? Clearly deeper, authentic, careful, humble interactions between the Western scientists and Indigenous and traditional knowledge keepers from around the world. So advanced co-production frameworks to bridge different knowledge systems. And it's often more about bridging knowledge systems and integrating knowledge systems, but ensuring that a diversity of knowledge systems are brought to bear in how interventions within the natural world for its restoration are designed and implemented. Clearly, and many of you are working or are linked to people working in the need for holistic metrics for biodiversity, biocultural indicators, ones that speak to relational health. And clearly we need to improve and deepen our study of the pathways that we need to tread in order to scale nature-based solutions while maintaining the complexity, diversity, and hence resilience of ecosystems, as well as social justice. In terms of ecologists, because I keep saying how important I think ecologists are, we really need to, as a community, really lean in to policy much more than we are. And I know some of you, I think we've got Sandra in the front row here as an ecologist, massively leaning into this space. But I think there needs to be more, because I think our insights into, or the insights of both traditional and Western ecologists, insights into what makes a healthy ecosystem, that knowledge can really help us understand how to reconfigure our economy. Understanding of resilience and complexity that needs to be informing how we design national and global frameworks, ensuring the join up in that policy among the different frameworks. For example, we need to be applying ecosystem principles to design regenerative economies. We need an economy that works like a rainforest with lots of growth, but growth that is generally sustainable or has a positive impact, rather than one that sort of just props up slightly less unsustainable behaviors and systems. And I think a really, really important area of work, and one that we're really starting to embrace more and more at the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, is studying reconnection, is really trying to address how do we address what is the crisis of separation that underpins almost all the other problems that we face. I mean, if we're just focused looking at climate change and biodiversity loss and inequality, even if we try and have a more joined up approach to those, all of those things are just symptoms. And a lot of the work we're doing is putting sticking plasters on the symptoms rather than looking at the root cause. And I am persuaded personally, and I'm persuaded by the evidence as well, that this is a crisis of separation, our separation from ourselves, from our communities, and particularly from the natural world in modern industrialized societies, which is at the root cause of the problems that we face. So I'm very encouraged by all the work that's going on involving radical collaborations between neuroscientists and artists and ecologists and economists to try and understand nature connection and how nature reconnection can inspire pro-environmental or nature-positive behaviours and cultures. I think this is really important. I get fed up in the spaces that I work. I'm often told that I'm too idealistic and that we can't possibly talk about behavioural change, that people don't change. I'm readily told people won't change. But I find when I talk to people, and I have had the privilege of talking to people as part of, say, citizens' assemblies, that actually people do change, will change, want to change, are prepared to make sacrifices for the sake of improving the well-being and for bigger processes are played. And people want a sense of agency, and we can ensure that they do through changing how we approach our research and the types of things we're focusing on. And Arne Næss, who, if you don't know, is a Norwegian philosopher who coined the term deep ecology a long time ago, he said a very beautiful thing. And he said that care flows naturally if the self is widened and deepened, so that the protection of free nature is felt and conceived as the protection of our very selves. In other words, if we love, we care. And if we care about something, we don't need regulations or carbon markets. We don't need to reduce our levels of consumption. We start shifting our behaviors in the West if we care more. So we know there's all sorts of wonderful work going on looking at nature-based solutions through this lens, that when we bring people together, involve them in a tree planting program or a river rewiggling, or just simple act of gardening, this can bring people closer together as communities, which is really important, and much closer to nature. And there is growing evidence that this increased connection with nature inspires people to behave in a more positive way towards the natural worlds of which they are a part. So I think all of that is a really interesting and exciting area of research that some of us might want to lean into, if we aren't doing so already. So the key messages from this talk: we need diverse knowledge systems to get humanity onto a genuinely sustainable trajectory. And I believe knowledge, ecological knowledge, is particularly key. I think there's a real need for ecologists to apply their existing knowledge about how ecosystems work and evolve, whilst also deepening emerging areas of research involving much more, as I say, more radical collaborations across the humanities and sciences divide. And I believe that, and I think there is growing evidence to really support this idea, that nature-based solutions can play a very important role in helping transform society if it is guided by the values that emerge from an ecocentric or kincentric worldview, that expand nature-based solutions from being way more than instrumental, reductive, materialistic, towards being relational, regenerative, and equitable. So with that, just like to thank my amazing team. And I would also particularly like to thank all the incredible Indigenous people who came to Oxford last summer at the summer solstice and brought their knowledge and their time to us, and really helped me and many of others, the rest of us who were there, to really think through much more deeply, in a much more sort of authentic way, our own relationship with nature, our relationship with the world, and what kind of world we want our children to inherit. And I will leave it there. So thank you very much for your time today as well.
Okay, thanks very much, Nat. That was really very interesting. I think you've woven in so many really complex things and such a comprehensive and
Thank you.
understand way. I have tons of questions, but I think we have more than in total we have more than 80 people online and in person. So I'll ask one simple one. I do want to make just one observation on the R's. It really hit me because I know we have people here from the education department, and from such a young age, we've been also hitting so hard with these R's, right? Reduce, reuse, recycle, and then recently added restore to this in our schools. And it's really interesting how we're talking about these interfaces of, you know, Indigenous or local knowledge and what we're doing ourselves and how much complementarity there is. So my question kind of is it goes back to the very basics of some of what you're talking about, that being an ecologist or being a, you know, whatever it is you are in terms of a researcher. In terms of bridging the global, the regional and the local. So we're often told, obviously, as researchers, that we need to cover all ground and discouraged from being regionally, having a regional expertise. So that could be geographical region, or it could be an ethnic region. And then in proposals, you know, how can this be scaled up? Well, it can't be scaled up. And it was something I think that you mentioned there, you know, it's a lot of regional stuff needs to be involved here, whilst at the same time, a lot of this global work needs to be going on as well. I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit, because it really interests me in terms of, you know, how to mentor the people that are coming through as students and are really interested in specific areas like the Amazon or Africa or Ghana or this, and they're sort of pushed away and they're told, no, but you have to be able to say the same thing about everywhere. And then we'll pass on to everyone else once they know.
Gosh. So I've got this, so it's fine. So is this, just to be clear, is this a question about how we link the local to the regional to the global, or how we empower individuals to engage at any one of those levels?
Do you think we should be empowering academics of different kinds to be able to be local or regional experts, or do we need to be able to cover all grounds?
I think you have to do what's authentic for you, don't you? I think there's a great, I mean, so I'm just if I may, with a slight personal story on that. I mean, I was always, I never expected to be in the UK by this point in my life. I was always going to go and live in a tropical forest for the rest of my life. I was always going to live around. For a while, I was going to try and get some land and build a sort of like an eco-tourist lodge. And it was always I would never thought about my own place at all. England was boring. There was no biodiversity there. It had all been lost. What was the point? It was this tiny island in the North Atlantic. Couldn't feel any emotional link to my land, right? To England. It was always somewhere else. And a big thing that's happened to me and to many people actually that I'm interacting with has just been a real sort of a pivot towards where we are now, because the only place that exists is now. And what we do here, so from a practical, so from a policy perspective, it's incredibly extraordinarily, the UK still has some influence in global platforms, right? And so it's really important, imperative to actually try and get our own house in order. For sort of speaking policy language, it's like, no, we really do need to try and get something to work in the UK if we are to have any to be taken seriously in international negotiations. If we're telling other countries that they need to look after nature, we need to get our own nature. And so there's a sort of a practical, kind of quite simple sort of reason why we need to do that. I think that's really, really powerful. But I just think in terms of our own reconnection as well, there's something about, there's this phrase, dig where you stand, be where you are now, and create goodness around where you are. So reconnect with your land. And we, in this part of the world, in Northern Europe and other parts of the world, we had that connection with land, connection with our ancestral knowledge, connection with our traditional wisdom, or connection with our ethnobotany, plant medicine, all of that. That was all removed through various processes that happened over hundreds of years. And we have this very reductive society, which when we've lost a lot of that practice and a lot of that knowledge, and it's very disorienting and doesn't really give us much, it doesn't empower us very much. And there is something to be said for really trying to reconnect with some of that, to give us a bit more authenticity, as I say, in international negotiations, but as also as part of reconnecting. And so I think, yes, we can, it's really important to understand how what we do here has ripple effects around the world, and understand that it's all really connected, and what we eat here and all our foods and our supply chains and so forth, to understand that there's that link. But I think there's a great deal of value to really try and understand where we are and be here now and do good things in your community. I think all of this stuff ripples up if the space where you are and the way you are personally and practically is nourished. No idea whether I answered your question. Something in that space, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I recognize that you are a terrestrial ecologist. I work in marine environment, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on marine spatial planning. I'm not sure how much you've interacted with it, but particularly maybe how you see nature-based solutions and marine spatial planning working together as frameworks, or if one is more over-encompassing than another, or perhaps one is more effective, or just how they exist in your
as framings, or as, I mean, marine spatial planning is a very powerful tool in marine restoration and protection of marine ecosystems.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah, I mean, it's a place-based, space-based, you know, territory-based way of sort of thinking about resources and inputs and outputs of that, of those spaces, and looking at the dependencies. If that can be embedded within quite a holistic framework that thinks about, you know, the societies dependent upon those systems and humans as ecosystem engineers within the marine environment. There's lots of brilliant examples, clam gardens and other examples from Pacific USA of people working as co-creators of ecosystems for long periods of time. And I'm not sure how much of that knowledge is informing marine spatial planning, but I believe there are some examples. I mean, nature-based solutions is a sort of overarching framework that in its very essence is an attempt to try and ensure that when we make interventions in the natural world, we're thinking about the holistic benefits, the long-term benefits and costs of doing that, rather than thinking about this is good for because it'll improve fish stocks for commercial available fisheries. It's also thinking about, well, what about the livelihoods, what about the carbon sequestration, what about the resilience that those ecosystems also confer on the coastline. They can't hear me through here. Okay.
Thank you for a very inspiring talk.
Oh, thank you.
You embodied very, very convincingly with indigenous examples and framings, like working with nature as nature, and some very concrete examples, mostly from indigenous peoples in indigenous land. I wonder whether the principles, the 4Rs and other principles would be the same, and the embodiment would be the same or slightly different when you are talking about, you know, Western urbanites.
I think the idea is that it's a way of relating to nature and our activities within it. So I think even in an urban environment, and maybe even especially as we're bringing natural systems back into the urban environment, there's a way of doing that which is more grounded and values-based. So it's more like we do it in this way, in a community-spirited way. We think holistically, we give as much as we take in all of these. We think about responsibility, who benefits. So in the urban environment, which I'm glad you mentioned, we think about redistribution and responsibility. I mean, who benefits from bringing nature back into cities? In many Western cities, wealthy people benefit because you bring nature there and instantly the house prices go up, the marginalized people move out. To bring nature back into cities in a way that we're aligned with these 4 values would be to ensure that that didn't happen. You know, it's to say, well, what we want is inclusion. And I think absolutely it's a way of relating to nature and a way of thinking about how we are doing things, not necessarily where we want to get to be. And I think in a rapidly warming world, we need that values aligned approach more than ever, because we don't know what's going to happen. We just know that a lot's going to change. And so we can get wedded to particular outcomes, ecological outcomes or social outcomes, that actually 10 years into the future are no longer relevant. But if we're doing what we're doing, and each step of that journey, we're thinking about reciprocity, we're thinking about relationality, we're thinking about responsibility. And if we do that, then we'll probably, in my view, there's a likelihood that we'll get to somewhere where we need to be, but we might not know where it is. But if we're doing things in the right way, the outcome will be better. Let's not think so much about the outcome, other than perhaps to, yeah, improve well-being. I don't.
Thank you, Nathalie.
Sorry, we reconfigured.
Thank you for the talk. Amazing. I have quite a short question, perhaps simple for you. Are there any sectors in which you see that NBS perhaps do not get along and cannot work with? Just to give an example, for instance, the oil extractive industry or the mining companies. So is there a way in which you can see the two of them together actually working out?
So it's a tricky one. We need to reduce or eliminate our dependency on fossil fuels. So there's a fundamental problem there. But in a sense, channeling investment to energy companies that are doing everything that they can to reduce humanity's dependency on fossil fuels. If they are then channeling some of their funding into interventions that reduce the harm they're having, especially if they do it locally. So not so much offsetting, but actually, obviously, as you know, drilling for oil causes an extraordinary amount of damage, both to local communities and the local ecosystems and the water quality. I mean, we don't see it, but it's horrendous, right? And those of you who do work in these sorts of frontiers in countries like Ecuador and so on will know how much damage is done. You're applying, investment in nature-based solutions to reduce or eliminate that, because a lot of that damage could be reduced and eliminated. Could make sense, but only if the goal is it's part of a strategy, as part of this transition, a just transition to eliminate our dependency upon the consumption that fuels the consumption of fossil fuels, then they could align. And in terms of, say, mining and extractive industries, there's been quite a lot of interest in the mining industry, for example, of reforesting mining areas that have been destroyed by mining, bringing that natural forest vegetation back in, trying to bring the health back of those ecosystems. So there's all sorts of sort of practical on the ground, nature-based solutions approaches that involve local communities repairing and healing these badly degraded landscapes. So those sorts of things. But ultimately, if we think back to that figure with the massive waves and the huge disparity between, extraction and investment into things that help nature, that's the problem we've got to solve. And that is going to be, it's both a demand and supply problem. I mean, it's a little bit of a polarized debate at the moment, with some people saying, no, we just need to reduce demand, and others it's saying it's all about supply. I mean, obviously both are needed, and nature-based solutions can help with that. But sometimes I think some of the most important thing that nature-based solutions can do is just speak to the underlying drivers of all of this, which is excessive consumption, particularly in Western industrialized societies. Western industrialized societies produce most of the emissions, right? We're suffering the least, but we're doing the most harm. We don't need half of the things that we think we need. What can we do in that space? And actually bringing people together, bringing communities together in nature can really help people, give them agency, a sense of hope, and help them be more environmentally, have more environmentally positive behaviors.
Right, I think we're having a little bit of tech issues, so I'm going to take your mic up to the back to ask the question and bring it back down to you. They can't hear us online.
Thank you. Really interesting talk. Oh, can you hear? So just following on from Sandra's, actually, how much research is going on in this respect in rural areas in countries like the UK? Our experience is actually that it maybe wasn't lost 100 years ago, but is on the verge of being lost now. We've done a lot of interviews with local people in the very local area outside Oxford, and people in their 80s, for example, have really deep local knowledge of not necessarily, where the lizards used to be in the dry stone wall, where the cowslips were. And I'm just interested in whether the similar approach is from academics like yourself is happening in the UK, or whether the focus is entirely on Indigenous communities abroad.
I want to go to the gym today.
Yeah, we have been having some technical issues. Apologies to all of you online who haven't been hearing the answers or the questions or both. I think this is the sunshine calling us, really, isn't it? It's like, well, if you nature-loving people, what are you doing all sitting inside a lecture theatre? We should all be. We should have had this this conversation in the forest, I think, shouldn't we? There's so much good, important work going on in the UK, and I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. Generally, as a society, we've lost a lot of knowledge, but as you say, there are individuals, older or elders. We have elders in this country too, who have a lot of incredible knowledge about nature here, how to relate to it, ethnobotanical knowledge as well, and collating that is a really important job. I'm not sure, I'm not connected with anyone here in Oxford who's working on that, but I know people are, and I'm certainly very glad you raised that, because there's sometimes a temptation in these is, yes, to bring examples from anywhere but the UK, but actually, as I said earlier, it's really what we do here is incredibly important for us personally and culturally, and also in terms of giving us greater authenticity in how we talk to the rest of the world about how we work together to solve the challenges we face. But I'd love to do that myself, a tour of the UK and collecting and talking to some of our elders and learning from them. Yeah, good question and good work. Yeah, yeah, I agree. I agree. We tend to think of ourselves as yeah, completely disconnected, but that's not true of everyone. Yeah, no, you're quite right. Thank you.
Okay, I know we have a couple of people waiting, but I do have a question online. Hi, Nathalie. Thanks for pointing out our stories of hope, which is refreshing. You mentioned that ecological systems thinking is not yet widely used. What would you say is the number one thing that food system / ecology researchers can do about it, especially given that integrating local knowledge, finding effective local interventions, and influencing local decisions takes time, which we are running out of? That's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, so the meta question in there is about time, isn't it? And the need to slow down in order to speed up. You need to slow down in order to make sure that the solutions we're co-creating together are going to be solutions. And there's a lot in the environmental movement. There's a lot of panic and rabbits in headlights and people sort of rushing ahead with possible solutions before there's real evidence that they can work. I think this is particularly a problem in the sort of the technology solution space, and we need to be really, really careful. And we've got so much to learn by sitting down and working with those communities within our food chain systems. You know, you said, oh, it'll take time, but it's possibly more a cost-effective thing to do ultimately to actually, you know, do that place-based research. In order to best understand sort of which species we can plant. We're just thinking about agroforestry. So there's lots of really interesting work going on in agroforestry, several recent meta-analyses really speaking to the importance of doing more agroforestry, especially when it, you know, planting trees among crops and crops among trees, when those trees are native species or climate resilient native species, and when the crops are diverse. But actually what works where is very, very place-based. So it's really important to do that. But at the same time, I guess, again, it's always finding the middle ground in a sense that we do need sort of top-down high-tech science to be able to better understand what possible future ecosystems might have to withstand, what agroforestry systems might need, what species they might need to include if they are to be resilient and productive. So again, it all boils down to coming together and making space for, you know, drawing on both the science and that local knowledge. But certainly when it comes to food systems, what grows where is, you know, there's been too much top-down imposition of crops that are not going to withstand any possible future combination of climate extremes. And the good work that's been done looking at that is, you know, very, very important.
Okay, thank you. I know we have lots more questions, but we're running out of time. Professor Seddon will be at the drinks afterwards for a little while, so please come along, the people that are in the room. But there have been two super enthusiastic people, so we'll just have two more questions, and then we'll head over for the drinks.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your fascinating sharing. And I wonder, would you like to share more your insights about the how to integrate the sciences and the humanities with nature positive cultures, and one day their ideologies might be conflicts with the different ethical morality or the economic political priorities. Thank you.
So the latter part of the question I didn't quite hear or understand, but you wanted me to speak to why it's important to have that, say, collaboration with the humanities. Did you want to clarify the second part? Sorry.
Like maybe the business school or the economists, they might prioritize some modeling for the economic outcome, but while the environment school, they may prioritize maybe the nature benefits, while education might be prioritized the morality or the ethical philosophies. So when they collaborate, how to form this kind of nature positive research cultures in their collaboration. Thank you.
So I think it's a really good question. Yeah, about how do we balance these things? I mean, we need there are so many different ways to approach the challenges that we face, and I think it's really important to give space to and listen to the different views. I think in terms of sort of economic priorities, it feels like, you know, the resilience of our system is being hugely tested by climate change in particular, or combination of climate change and biodiversity loss. And that actually, in the conversations that I'm in involving people from lots of different disciplines, it feels like suddenly everything is back on the table because nothing is working, right? And so I'm finding that there's actually more openness to thinking a bit more radically about how can we, for example, use art to inspire care for nature. You know, art gives permission to feel, and where there's feelings, then things start to happen, right, in terms of motivating. And we've got this problem at the moment with pessimism around what's going on with the geopolitics leading to paralysis. People have lost their sense of agency, especially young people. I mean, there's a huge debate on this, which I'm not going to get into now. And some people saying there's a problem with being more hopeful. But in my experiences, hope tends to be a little bit more of a motivator, or can be a very strong motivator. And art can really help with that, can help motivate. So that's your sort of answer to that question, I think. But in terms of, just making space for diverse views and understanding that, and that's what's been really powerful about these citizens' assemblies, was that they give an opportunity for that. And actually, when people are informed and when they are listening to one another, amazing acts of creativity tend to emerge and areas of consensus tend to be found. So I'm very hopeful that there's the growing movement around citizens' assemblies, which helps bring diverse views to the table and provides a method for them being listened to, as a really important thing to focus on and encourage. Okay.
Okay, Kim, last question.
Thanks, Nathalie. I just wanted to make a quick comment from my observation. So I spend a lot of time talking to teachers who take kids outdoors and do various types of nature education with them. And that theory of change about learning about, therefore loving, therefore caring, you definitely see that happen. You know, I get a kid who wants to kill a worm and 20 other kids go and defend the worm. You know, it happens really quickly. But also what's coming through in this work is seeing that one of the things that the schools most value is the fact that when they take kids out in nature, it's the human to human connections that improve. And there's something about being outside in nature that actually allows people to create those relationships. And I've been looking at the concept of peace education, which comes from Hilary Kremins at Cambridge, head of education department, I think there. And your 4 R's there very much sort of reflected in the pedagogy of peace education. But currently peace education doesn't really take into account nature in a very sort of bleak way. And I'm excited about the idea that there's some knitting to be done between what people are perhaps doing in an urban setting, just trying to get people to get on better, and how does that work in nature? That's what I was going to say.
That's a comment rather than the question. I think we got one more question. Is it a question?
No, it's not a question.
Okay. Great.
Thank you for the talk, Nathalie. I think there's an elephant in the room of nature-based solutions, which is climate change and how it interferes with the success of those initiatives. But also there is this misalignment with initiatives on the ground and what the science is putting out. So NGOs, philanthropies rushing to get nature-based solutions projects on the ground and running, but ignoring climate projections. And of course, that the whole landscape is way more flammable and just destroying initiatives to contain biodiversity loss and climate mitigation initiatives, or even agroforestry projects completely either burning down or having the crops like cocoa or banana dying because of drought. So how do you see these reconciliations between what the science is projecting climate-wise, what it's being done on the ground?
So the key is adaptive management, isn't it? And encouraging, and I do speak a lot about this actually, just in encouraging an experimental approach to nature-based, to the implementation of nature-based solutions, not just an experimental approach, but also an approach to where you've got monitoring and evaluating embedded in it as well. So that, you know, lots of investment might go into projects that don't work, but we just need, and that's okay. It needs to be okay because we don't know what's coming, and we need these multifunctional landscapes, I think. And as long as we've learned from why things have failed, that the tragedy is when we make mistakes and then we don't know why, and then we make them again and again. So I think, but trying to win that argument in the corporate space is quite challenging. Although there are some actors in the private sector who recognise the importance of experiments and are prepared to invest in experiments. But it's a different type of investment that requires a longer term horizon. And it's okay for its return on investment to be, say, biodiversity, and for that investment to be, you know, bear fruit in 20 years' time. So it's about how do we find those sort of, you know, blended finance mechanisms and other financial instruments that can accommodate experiment, and how can we as scientists sort of help to design landscapes and interventions, working with local communities and drawing on their already existing knowledge about what good adaptive management looks like. So that's the key thing. Yeah, rushing in without a design, an experimental design, and no framework for measuring the outcome is the big problem. Not the failure in of itself could be very instructive.
Okay, I think the fact that we still have people that want to ask questions is a testament to what an interesting conversation that you've brought up today. So we're really grateful. Thank you. If we could have one more round of applause, please, for Professor Seddon. Certainly some of the things that were brought up today, I would also love to discuss with people. If people want to have a chat over there about the things they've brought up today. And anyone else that's going out to enjoy the sun, thank you for coming and have a lovely weekend. And thank you to everyone online as well.